Welcome back to Living Focus. If you remember, we are in the middle of a two-part series on the power of forgiveness. And last week when we got together, we talked about some of the negative impact that it can have on our lives whenever we withhold forgiveness from others. We talked about how withholding forgiveness can have a negative impact on our focus and on our effectiveness because we fixate on the very thing that we consider to be an injustice towards us. We talked about how it can have a negative impact on our physical health. And finally, we talked about how it can have a negative impact on our spiritual growth. This week, I'd like to continue in this series, and I want us to learn and explore a few more things about forgiveness. But before we move on, let me encourage you, if you would, if you've not yet followed the channel, to just go below here and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you wouldn't mind liking the episode, that would be great too. But I also wanted to let you know that so much of the information that I've, that has inspired me for this series comes from a little ebook that I read, and it takes about 20 minutes to read it, and I put the link to that ebook down in the subscription. I think it costs about $6.99 if you'd like to go there. Follow the link, learn a little bit about the book. I'm telling you what, it had some great thoughts in it that I felt like I needed to remember and kind of inspired me. And so some of what I'm sharing today was inspired by that book, and I just wanted to share that with you, and you can find the link to that down in the subscription. But anyway, I want to continue on here if we can, and I'd like to move on and talk about another aspect of forgiveness. And that is, I want you to understand that as a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ, that forgiveness really is an expectation. I know sometimes we think to ourselves, well, I wonder if this is an option or not. Do I really have to forgive? Okay, I get it. You want to wrestle with it. You want to find a way not to have to forgive. But I want you to understand something. It is very clear that God expects you and I to respond with the grace that we received ourselves. All right? And oftentimes, whenever we withhold forgiveness, it comes from the fact that our reasoning is flawed in the first place. If I'm going to think about what the Lord expects of me, I'm going to look to the example of Jesus, aren't you? And if I learn anything from the example of Jesus, I understand this, that Jesus himself, while on the cross, forgave those people who crucified him. Now, friends, I got to tell you, that exemplifies to me our duty as Christians to forgive, even in the face of an injustice. Even if we've been dealt with wrongly, if it's unjust, it doesn't mean that we are exempt from forgiving. Not at all. Jesus is our example. Jesus forgave those who crucified him while he was on the cross. And you see, what I think we don't understand sometimes is that whenever you and I refuse to forgive, all that does is perpetuate this cycle of pain. And not only does it do that, it contradicts the teachings of Jesus, who calls you and I to extend grace and love regardless of the circumstances that we deal with. Now, another reason we might withhold forgiveness is we feel like we need to participate in this retribution towards the person who hit us, or ensure that justice is really done the way we think justice towards them should really be carried out. Now, I have to tell you that sometimes I think we wrongly believe that holding on to anger is a way to ensure that the wrongdoer is held accountable to the standards that we feel they should be held accountable. If we don't do this, someone else is going to let them off the hook. But friends, the Bible repeatedly teaches us that it's not our job. That is above our pay grade. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 is a great example of that. It reminds us that vengeance belongs to God and God alone. It's not ours. So in seeking revenge through unforgiveness, what you and I are doing is we are forgetting that this is the Lord's job and we can trust him with it, that he is going to act just. If there's one thing we can say about God, is he is just. I mean, there's a lot of things we can say about him, but we know that he is just. But also, I think whenever we seem to take things into our own hands and hold on to the spirit of unforgiveness, we overlook the power of redemption that forgiveness can bring in a relationship. We forget that there is this power and this potential for transformation, not only in the life of the offender, but also in the life of the offended. And what happens is we hold on to all of this stuff out of this skewed sense of justice, and all that does is undermine the very essence of Christian compassion and Christian mercy. I get it that often the reasons that we might feel entitled to withhold forgiveness they're often based on misguided notions that go against the core teachings of Jesus. I mean, we've got to recognize that. We just have to recognize that. We at least have integrity enough to admit that. I mean, you're holding on to unforgiveness, but don't act like that God is blessing it, or that you're somehow honoring God in your unforgiving spirit. Don't fool yourself into believing that, because according to Scripture, it's clear. God expects us to have a spirit of compassion, mercy, love, and grace. And forgiveness is expected just as we received forgiveness. I think about the Lord's Prayer, Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, where it talks a little bit about the reciprocal nature of forgiveness. And it says, forgive us of our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. Well, we got to go on here because I don't want to take forever on this, but we do need to talk about how do we prepare our hearts and minds to actually extend forgiveness to others? Well, that's a good question. And one of the things I realize is that we've got to be very intentional about it. And one of the first things that we need to come to grips with, if we're going to prepare our heart and mind to be a person who forgives and extends forgiveness, is we've got to acknowledge our own need for forgiveness first. That we are people who are guilty of sin. We are people who are guilty of offenses. And we are people who needed God's forgiveness as well. Psalm chapter 32, verse 5 declares this: Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sins. You see, by recognizing our own imperfections, you and I gain perspective on the depth of God's grace and mercy that has been extended to us. And so let's first stop and say, okay, if I'm going to prepare my heart and mind for this, I've got to recognize how I have benefited and been blessed and have stood in need of God's mercy and grace, love, and forgiveness. But secondly, I think the second intentional step we need to take is that we need to be willing to pray. Pray for God's strength and willingness to forgive. This is something that I have to pray all the time because honestly, I carry things from my past. I still carry wounds just like you do. We've all been broken. We've all been hurt. And sometimes we just have to recognize in our prayer time, God, I need you and I need your strength and I need you to change my heart to give me the willingness to forgive. God, this is a divine act and I need you. So help me. Give me the strength to do that and trust God to begin overcoming the hurt in your own heart and then begin changing your heart to give you a willingness to begin to the process of forgiving someone else. So yeah, we've got to intentionally prepare our hearts and minds. We do it by remembering that we needed God's grace and forgiveness, but we also do it by asking God to give us the strength and willingness to forgive. Which leads me to the third thing and the final thing I want us to address today. And that is we need to understand that if we're going to offer forgiveness, we are going to have to overcome challenges. I get it. Forgiving someone is a divine command. I get it. God expects us to do that, but it doesn't come without challenges. And one of those challenges is, this desire we have to see someone else pay the price for what they've done to us. And we've already talked about that a little bit. We've already mentioned Romans chapter 12, 19, where it says, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So we're going to have to overcome the challenge of saying, I want to take this into my own hands, and I want to make sure that retribution is done, justice the way I see justice is taken out on that person. So that's a challenge we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to fight against that and ask God to help us to let go of that. But the second challenge that we have to deal with is we have to be willing to be made vulnerable. Be vulnerable. You see, offering forgiveness sometimes requires us to lay down our pride and open ourselves up to potential hurt. You know, however, in 2 Corinthians 12:9, it reminds us that God's power is made perfect in weakness. And so whenever we are vulnerable and we open up our hearts, we open up our pride, we open ourselves up to potential hurt, it gives the opportunity for God to work miraculously and powerfully in this and to work perfectly in it. So you're going to have to be willing to risk being a little bit vulnerable here. Listen, the act of forgiveness really does hold tremendous power. It does impact our focus. It does impact our health. It will impact our spiritual growth, and it does impact our relationships. And as a Christian, you and I are called to embody the forgiveness and the love that has been demonstrated by Jesus Christ. And by participating in this forgiveness, you and I are also participating in God's redemptive work and experiencing the transformative effects of God's grace in our lives. Let's learn to practice forgiveness. Let's learn to extend that grace that God has extended to us. And let's see his transforming power not only work in our lives, but it also work in our relationships. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Don't forget, subscribe to the program. We'd love to have you do that. You can do that right under the video here. And don't forget to check out the book, Unburdened Hearts. It's the link to it is in the description below. But anyway, God bless you. I'll look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday, right back here on Living Focused.